On February 13, 1542, a 19-year-old girl knelt on the frozen scaffold at the Tower of London. She placed her head on the execution block. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was the Queen of England. In less than 60 seconds, the executioner's axe would slice through her neck. It would be a single brutal stroke. Her severed head would tumble into the straw. Her body would be dumped into an unmarked grave. She was buried as a traitor alongside her cousin, Anne Boleyn. Anne had met the exact same fate just 6 years earlier in the exact same spot. These were two queens and two cousins. Both were married to the same man. Both were accused of adultery. Both were executed before they turned 30 years old. Here is what makes this story even more disturbing. The place where Catherine Howard's life fell apart was not the Tower of London. It was Hampton Court Palace. This magnificent red brick palace sits on the banks of the River Thames. It is just 12 miles from central London. The palace was so beautiful it was called more like unto paradise than any earthly habitation. It had 1,000 rooms, 60 acres of gardens, and 241 decorative chimneys. These chimneys rose into the English sky. Kings dined on roasted swan inside while musicians played from gilded galleries. Courtiers in velvet and silk plotted and schemed in shadowy corridors. Every wall had ears. Every smile concealed a knife. This is Hampton Court Palace. This is the story of how luxury, paranoia, and royal madness turned paradise into a prison. The most powerful man in England murdered his way through 6 wives. He lived in the most beautiful home in Europe. A building designed for pleasure became synonymous with terror. The ghosts of the women who died here allegedly still scream in the galleries 500 years later. Let us start with the man who built this palace. No, it was not Henry VIII. It was Thomas Wolsey. He was the son of a butcher from Ipswich. He somehow became the most powerful man in England. He held titles such as Cardinal Wolsey, Archbishop of York, and Lord Chancellor. He was the king's chief minister. He was possibly the richest commoner in the entire kingdom. In 1514, Wolsey leased a small manor house. It was from the Knights Hospitaller of St. John of Jerusalem. It was a decent property, but nothing special. It was a medieval house on the Thames with some land attached. Wolsey had big ambitions. He wanted to build a palace that would make emperors weep with envy. He wanted to prove to the world that an English cardinal could live as magnificently as any prince in Rome, or as magnificently as any duke in Florence. Over the next 7 years, Wolsey spent 200,000 gold crowns on Hampton Court. To put that in perspective, that is roughly $200 million in today's money. He did not just renovate the old manor house. He demolished it and flattened it. He started from scratch. He hired the finest Italian craftsmen. He imported the most expensive materials. He built courtyards within courtyards. He created apartments lined with hundreds of tapestries from the continent. These tapestries were changed every single week. This showed his absurd wealth. The palace Wolsey created was a masterpiece of Tudor architecture. It had red and pink bricks arranged in intricate patterns. Stone dressings were carved with exquisite detail. And then there were those chimneys, 241 twisted brick chimneys, each one slightly different from the others. They rose above the courtyards like a forest of sculptured pillars. The main gatehouse featured flanking towers and a beautiful oriel window. Inside, visitors had to walk through 8 rooms before reaching Wolsey's audience chamber. Each of these rooms displayed increasing magnificence. Each one was more lavishly decorated than the last. This was designed to overwhelm visitors with sheer opulence. Wolsey lived at Hampton Court like a prince. Actually, he lived better than most princes. He had a household of nearly 500 people. He entertained constantly. In 1527, he hosted the French ambassador and his retinue of 400 guests. This occurred when a treaty between England and France was signed. The festivities lasted for days. The food was legendary. The wine flowed like water. Foreign dignitaries left, saying Hampton Court outshone even the palaces of the Habsburg emperors. However, there was one massive problem. King Henry VIII saw Hampton Court. He wanted it. Now, let us talk about Henry for a moment. In 1525, when he first stayed at Hampton Court as Wolsey's guest, Henry was still relatively young. He was 34 years old. He was not yet the bloated, diseased, paranoid tyrant he would become. He was athletic and handsome. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall. This was in an era when most men barely reached 5 feet 6 inches. He jousted, hunted, and played tennis. He composed music and spoke multiple languages. Women found him devastatingly attractive. Men wanted to be like him. However, Henry had several problems. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for 16 years. She had given him only one surviving child, a daughter named Princess Mary. Henry needed a son. England needed a male heir. The country had been torn apart by civil war less than 50 years earlier during the Wars of the Roses. Everyone remembered the chaos when the succession was unclear. A daughter could not inherit the throne. It was unthinkable, at least to Henry. So Henry wanted a divorce, or technically, an annulment. He wanted the Pope to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. He had also fallen madly and obsessively in love with Anne Boleyn. Anne was a dark-haired lady-in-waiting who refused to sleep with him unless he married her first. Anne was smart and calculating. She kept the king dangling for 6 years. This drove him half insane with frustrated desire while she held out for a wedding ring and a crown. Wolsey's job, as Lord Chancellor, was to get Henry his annulment. He needed to negotiate with the Pope and find a legal loophole. He had to make it happen. But Wolsey failed. The Pope refused. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. The Pope was not about to anger Charles by declaring his aunt's marriage invalid. Wolsey tried for years. He begged, bargained, and threatened. Nothing worked, and Henry did not take failure well. In 1529, Wolsey knew he was finished. He could see the writing on the wall. The king was furious. Anne Boleyn hated him. His enemies at court were circling like sharks. So Wolsey made a desperate move. He gave Hampton Court to the king. This included the entire palace, all the buildings, all the furnishings, and all the tapestries and gold plate. Everything was a magnificent, extraordinarily expensive gift designed to save his life. It did not work. Henry took the palace gladly and immediately. Within 6 months, he began his own massive rebuilding program. But taking Hampton Court did not save Wolsey. Nothing could save Wolsey now. He was stripped of all his other offices and properties. He was arrested on charges of treason. He died in November 1530 on his way to London to face trial. He was probably aware that if he had lived another week, his head would have been on a spike on London Bridge. Some say he died of natural causes. Others whisper poison. We will never know. However, Hampton Court became Henry's favorite residence for the rest of his life. He spent more money on it than any of his other palaces. He spent more time there than anywhere else. He brought all 6 of his wives there. Every single one. Some came as brides, eager and hopeful. Some came as prisoners, terrified and desperate. 2 of them would be dead within months of arriving. Let us talk about those wives. Hampton Court Palace is not just the story of a building. It is the story of the women who walked its corridors. They slept in its chambers. They gave birth there. They died there. Their ghosts, allegedly, have never left. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, visited Hampton Court. However, she never truly made it her home. By the time Henry took possession of the palace, their marriage was already doomed. She was older than Henry and increasingly religious. She had stopped trying to please him. Henry had moved on. He was focused on Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn certainly left her mark on Hampton Court, literally. When Anne became queen in 1533, Henry expanded Hampton Court. He increased it by nearly 50% to create new royal apartments for her. Anne had spent years at the French court. She understood Renaissance architecture and power. She understood how buildings could project magnificence and intimidation. She worked with Henry to make Hampton Court even grander than Wolsey's original vision. The Great Hall was built for Anne. This magnificent space has a carved hammer-beam roof that took 5 years to complete. The ceiling is decorated with Anne's falcon badge. Her initials were carved into the woodwork, entwined with Henry's in lovers' knots. Most of them are still there. After Anne's execution, Henry ordered every trace of her removed from the palace. Courtiers rushed to chisel away her badges, her initials, and her coat of arms, but they missed a few. In the Great Hall, on the wooden panels flanking the minstrel's gallery, you can still see 2 sets of intertwined H and A letters. They are hidden in plain sight. These are survivors of Henry's rage. Anne spent a lot of time at Hampton Court. She was proclaimed queen there in August 1533. She dined in the Great Hall. She walked in the gardens. She attended Mass in the Chapel Royal beneath its dazzling blue and gold ceiling. She became pregnant there and lost babies there. The miscarriages haunted her. Henry had waited 6 years to marry her. He had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and torn England away from the Catholic Church. He created the Church of England with himself as its head. All of this was so he could marry Anne Boleyn and get his male heir. However, Anne only gave him a daughter, Elizabeth. She was born in September 1533. Elizabeth was a healthy, beautiful baby girl. But she was not the son Henry needed. Anne became pregnant again and again, but the pregnancies ended in miscarriages. In January 1536, she miscarried a male fetus at around 4 months gestation. That was the end. Henry told his courtiers that Anne had seduced him through witchcraft and sorcery. He convinced himself the marriage was cursed. He already had his eye on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies, in waiting. Jane was quiet and submissive, the opposite of Anne in every way. In May 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace. She was taken to the Tower of London. The charges were insane. They included adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. She was also accused of plotting to murder the king and treason. All of it was fabricated. All of it was lies concocted by Thomas Cromwell and Henry's other ministers. This was to give Henry the legal justification he needed. Anne was tried by a jury of peers. All of them were hand-picked to deliver the verdict Henry wanted. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. Henry had shown her one small mercy. Burning at the stake was the legal punishment for a queen convicted of treason. She might also have been killed with an axe. Instead, she would be executed by an expert swordsman. He was brought from France specifically for this purpose. The executioner killed her with a single swing of his sword. Her head came off cleanly. She was dead before she hit the ground. She was probably only 35 years old. She may have been younger. Her body was shoved into an old elm chest. This chest had once held bow staves. She was then buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was the third wife. She was the quiet and obedient one. She finally gave Henry his son, and she died for it. Henry brought Jane to Hampton Court immediately after their wedding in May 1536. He had new apartments built for her. He showered her with attention. By all accounts, he was genuinely fond of her. She was gentle and peaceful. She never argued with him or contradicted him. After the drama and chaos of Anne Boleyn, Jane must have seemed like a gift from heaven. She became pregnant almost immediately. In September 1537, Jane entered her confinement at Hampton Court. This traditional period of isolation began shortly before a royal birth. She was moved into a specially prepared chamber overlooking Clock Court. The room was hung with thick fabric and tapestries. The windows were covered to let in only a small amount of light. Only women were allowed inside. However, Henry's most trusted doctor, Sir William Butts, was also permitted to attend her. Jane went into labor on the afternoon of October 9, 1537. The labor lasted 2 days and 3 nights. She endured 51 hours of agony. The baby was not positioned correctly. Jane was exhausted, terrified, and in constant pain. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 12th, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. This was Prince Edward, the future Edward VI. Henry had waited 28 years to father this son. The entire kingdom exploded with joy. 2,000 rounds of ammunition were fired from the Tower of London in celebration. Henry rode to Hampton Court to meet his precious jewel, his son and heir, the savior of his dynasty. A lavish christening was held 3 days later in the Chapel Royal. Edward was carried in by his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Jane herself sat upright in bed. She wore a gown of red velvet edged with ermine. She received the guests who attended her son's baptism. She seemed fine. Plans were already being made for her churching. This was the ceremony where new mothers returned to public life after giving birth. However, on October 16th, 4 days after the birth, Jane suddenly became ill. She developed a fever and felt nauseous. She also complained of pain. Her attendants wrapped her in furs. They fed her rich foods. But her condition deteriorated rapidly. We do not know exactly what killed Jane Seymour. For centuries, historians assumed it was puerperal fever, a common post-childbirth infection. Recent research, however, suggests it might have been food poisoning that led to a secondary infection, or possibly retained placenta that the doctors and midwives failed to remove, causing septicemia. What we do know is that Jane spent 8 days in increasing agony. Doctors stood helplessly by. She died just before midnight on October 24, 1537. She was 29 years old. She had been queen for barely 18 months. Henry was genuinely and truly devastated. He railed against divine providence for tainting the joy of his son's birth with the bitterness of death. He retreated to Westminster and mourned in isolation for weeks. The court plunged into mourning. The rooms of Hampton Court were draped in black fabric. When Henry died 10 years later, he chose to be buried beside Jane at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Jane was the only wife he asked to be buried with. Some say she was his favorite. Others argue that she just had the good fortune to die before Henry could find fault with her. Either way, Jane Seymour gave her life to give Henry his son in that room at Hampton Court. The room still exists. It is called Apartment 33 now. Palace staff still use it for meetings and training courses. And according to some who have been there, the room has a very strange atmosphere. It possesses a coldness and a sadness. Something makes the hair on your arms stand up. Jane's ghost is said to appear there occasionally. It is a sad white figure carrying a lighted candle. It walks the same path she took from her birthing chamber to the Chapel Royal. This occurs on the night of her son's christening. After Jane's death, Henry married 3 more times. He had 3 more wives, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. All 3 came to Hampton Court. However, only one of those stories ends in screams and blood. Anne of Cleves, wife number 4, was a political marriage. Henry needed an alliance with the German Protestant states. He had never met Anne. He agreed to marry her based on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. When Anne arrived in England in January 1540, Henry took one look at her and was revolted. He referred to her as a Flanders mare. He found her unattractive, unsophisticated, and boring. The marriage was never consummated. Henry had it annulled after 6 months. Anne agreed to everything. She was given a generous settlement, several houses, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She lived comfortably in England for another 17 years. She was the only wife who survived Henry and kept her head. She was a smart woman. Then came Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard's story is the Hampton Court Palace horror story. This story turned the beautiful palace into a haunted house. It makes visitors today walk through the haunted gallery with goosebumps on their arms. They also feel an inexplicable chill down their spines. Catherine Howard was Anne Boleyn's first cousin. She was another Howard girl from one of the most powerful noble families in England. She was probably born around 1523 or 1524. This made her somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. 50-year-old King Henry married her in July 1540. She was a teenage girl married to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Henry was an obese and diseased man. He was chronically paranoid. A rotting ulcer on his leg stank so badly, courtiers could smell him coming from 3 rooms away. Henry called Catherine his rose without a thorn. He was infatuated with her, even obsessed. She was young, beautiful, vivacious, and full of life. She was everything he was no longer. He lavished her with jewels and gowns. He took her to Hampton Court. He paraded her at court. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. However, Catherine was young. She was also reckless. Before her marriage, she lived in her grandmother's household. There, she had been sexually involved with her music teacher, Henry Mannix. Later, she was involved with a young man named Francis Dereham. These were not innocent flirtations. They were full sexual relationships. In Tudor England, a woman not a virgin at marriage faced grave danger. She could be accused of treason if she married the king. This was the case if she failed to disclose her sexual history. Catherine never told Henry. Maybe she thought no one would find out. Maybe she was too scared. Maybe she genuinely thought it did not matter. However, someone knew. In Tudor England, secrets like that were weapons. After her marriage, Catherine made things infinitely worse. She began an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Culpeper was one of Henry's favorites. He was a handsome young courtier who had easy access to the royal apartments. Catherine and Thomas met secretly. They exchanged love letters. They took insane risks. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, helped facilitate their meetings. Jane Boleyn was Anne Boleyn's widow. She stood guard while they talked. She also delivered their messages. In November 1541, Henry and Catherine returned to Hampton Court after a successful 5-month tour of the northern counties. It was the Feast of All Saints. Catherine wore her crown and walked in procession to her closet above the Chapel Royal to hear Mass. The Bishop of Lincoln offered prayers of thanksgiving for the king's happiness and the good life he led with his queen. Everything seemed perfect. Everything was not perfect. Someone had talked. A servant, a man named John Lascelles, went to Archbishop Cranmer. He had information about Catherine's past relationships with Manox and Derham. Cranmer investigated these claims. The stories checked out. The investigation then uncovered something even worse. Catherine was having an affair with Culpeper. This constituted active treason. She was sleeping with another man while married to the king. On November 5, 1541, while Henry was sitting in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, Cranmer handed him a letter. What Cranmer had to say was too terrible to speak aloud. The letter detailed Catherine's sexual history. It also revealed her affair with Culpeper. This provided evidence of her betrayal. Henry did not believe it at first. He ordered an investigation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Manox, Derham, and Culpeper were all arrested and interrogated. Derham and Culpeper confessed under torture. Catherine herself was placed under house arrest in her apartments at Hampton Court while the interrogations continued. This is where the legend begins. This story has turned Hampton Court's gallery into one of England's most haunted places. According to legend, Catherine learned she was about to be arrested. She broke free from her guards. She ran through what is now called the Haunted Gallery, screaming for Henry. She tried to reach him in the Chapel Royal. She begged him to show mercy. She pleaded to explain herself and to spare her life. Henry, however, refused to see her. His guards caught her just before she reached the chapel doors. They dragged her back to her rooms, kicking, screaming, and crying. She never saw Henry again. Most historians do not think this actually happened. The legend's description is likely inaccurate. The geography did not quite work. Catherine's apartments were in a different part of the palace. The route to the chapel would not have taken her through the haunted gallery. Moreover, Henry had left Hampton Court secretly before Catherine was officially informed of the charges against her. He never gave her a chance to plead her case. However, something happened in that gallery. For the past 200 years, people have reported strange experiences there. Visitors report a sudden drop in temperature at one specific corner. This is where two arms of the gallery meet. They also feel watched. Some experience a sensation of invisible hands on their throat. The sound of screaming and the smell of fear have also been reported. In May 2000, a psychologist named Richard Wiseman conducted an experiment. He asked visitors to walk through the palace and record any unusual experiences. Both believers and non-believers in the paranormal reported more strange sensations in the haunted gallery than anywhere else in the palace. 2 women fainted in the exact same spot on the same day during separate tours. In 2003, Palace CCTV captured footage of a ghostly figure in a long robe throwing open the fire doors in the gallery. The doors had been opening by themselves for 3 consecutive days. On the second day, the cameras caught a tall figure in period dress pushing them open. Security staff watched the footage. No living person came forward to admit it was a prank. The figure remains unexplained. The media called it Skeletor. Some said it was Henry's ghost. Others said it was Catherine. The footage went international. What we do know is what happened to Catherine after her arrest. She was moved from Hampton Court to Sion House. She was then moved to the Tower of London. Culpeper and Derham were executed in December 1541. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. Their heads were mounted on spikes on London Bridge. Catherine's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, was imprisoned. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, turned on her completely to save himself. On the 10th of February 1542, Parliament passed a bill of attainder declaring Catherine guilty of treason. She was sentenced to death. On the 13th of February, she was taken from her cell in the Tower to Tower Green. This was the same place where Anne Boleyn had died. The execution was private, not public. Only a small crowd of courtiers and officials watched. Catherine was terrified. She had spent the night before practicing how to lay her head on the block. She tried to get it right. She tried to maintain some dignity in her final moments. She was 19 years old, or perhaps 18 years old. Sources differ on her exact birth date, but she was young, so young. At dawn on the 13th of February, the executioner's axe came down and ended her life with a single stroke. Her body was buried beside Anne Boleyn's in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. 2 Howard girls, both queens. Both were dead before age 35. Both were killed by the same man. Henry married one more time. His 6th wife was Catherine Parr. She also came to Hampton Court. In fact, she married Henry there. The wedding took place in July 1543 in the Holyday Closet. This room was part of the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. It was a small, quiet ceremony. It was nothing like the grand celebrations that had marked Henry's earlier marriages. Catherine Parr was different from the others. She was older, 31 years old, when she married Henry. She was educated and intelligent. She had been married twice before and widowed twice. She knew how to handle powerful men. She knew when to be quiet and when to speak. She also knew how to survive. More than just surviving, she thrived. She became the first English queen to write and publish her own books. She reconciled Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She helped restore them to the line of succession. She nursed Henry through his final years as his health deteriorated. The ulcer on his leg worsened. He became increasingly obese. He grew increasingly paranoid. He also became increasingly violent. In January 1547, Henry died at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. Catherine Parr outlived him by only 18 months. She died of childbirth complications in September 1548. This happened after marrying Thomas Seymour and having a baby at age 36. But she got to die in her own bed, of natural causes. She did not die on a scaffold with an axe coming down on her neck. That outcome counted as a victory in Tudor England. After Henry's death, Hampton Court continued to be used by the royal family. However, its golden age was over. Edward VI, Jane Seymour's son, lived there briefly as a child. His sisters Mary and Elizabeth both visited during their reigns. William Shakespeare and his company performed plays in the Great Hall. Mary I imprisoned her half-sister Elizabeth there briefly in 1554. This was because she suspected Elizabeth of involvement in a plot. In 1689, William III and Mary II took the throne. They hated Hampton Court's Tudor architecture. They wanted something modern. They wanted something Baroque. They wanted something that could rival Versailles. They hired Sir Christopher Wren, who was England's greatest architect. They ordered him to demolish most of the Tudor palace. Their goal was to replace it with something completely new. Wren's plan was radical. He would keep the Great Hall and the Chapel Royal. Everything else would go. In its place, he would build a magnificent Baroque palace. It would feature elegant state apartments, formal gardens, and fountains. These features would compete with anything Louis XIV had at Versailles. Work began in 1689 and continued for years. Wren demolished entire wings. He built new courtyards. He created the stunning Fountain Court at the heart of the new palace. But then Mary died of smallpox in 1694. William lost interest in the project. Work stopped. Half of Henry's Tudor palace survived. The other half was replaced by Wren's Baroque masterpiece. Today, Hampton Court is this bizarre hybrid. On one side, there are Tudor courtyards and twisted chimneys. On the other side, there are classical colonnades and formal symmetry. It should not work, but somehow it does. The pink and red bricks tie it all together. The architecture is beautiful in both styles. It is a palace that visually represents 500 years of English history in a single building. George I and George II both used Hampton Court regularly in the 1700s. They hosted elaborate summer courts there. The palace was alive with music, dancing, gossip, flirtation, and political scheming. The Georgian kings added their own apartments and made their own modifications. But after George II died in 1760, no monarch ever lived at Hampton Court again. George III abandoned it as a royal residence in 1760. The palace was then given over to grace and favor residents. These were impoverished aristocrats and retired royal servants. They were allowed to live there, rent-free as a reward for their service. In 1838, Queen Victoria opened Hampton Court to the public. Suddenly, anyone could walk through the courtyards and galleries. Here, Henry VIII had murdered his way through 6 wives. Anyone could see the Great Hall where Anne Boleyn's badges still decorated the ceiling. Anyone could walk down the haunted gallery and feel that inexplicable chill. The palace became one of Britain's most popular tourist attractions. It remains one of Britain's most popular tourist attractions today. In 1986, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the Grace and Favor apartments, specifically in the King's apartments. Lady Gale, one of the residents, died in the blaze. She had apparently taken a lighted candle to her bedroom. The candle started the fire. The King's State apartments suffered extensive damage. It took years of restoration work to repair them. The fire was a tragedy. However, it also led to important archaeological discoveries. Historians learned new things about the Tudor Palace underneath the later additions. Today, Hampton Court Palace is cared for by Historic Royal Palaces, an independent charity. It receives no government funding. It also receives no money from the crown. It supports itself entirely through ticket sales, memberships, and private donations. About 500,000 people visit every year. They come to see the Tudor kitchens and the Great Hall. They also visit the Chapel Royal with its blue and gold ceiling. Other attractions include the Georgian State Apartments and the famous maze planted in the 1690s. Visitors explore the oldest parts of the garden. They also marvel at the astronomical clock installed by Henry in 1540, which still works today. But mostly, they come for the ghosts. They come for the stories, the horror, and the darkness underneath all that beauty. They come to stand in the haunted gallery and feel that cold spot. They look for Catherine Howard's ghost. They imagine her running through the corridors, screaming for mercy that never came. They come to see apartment 33, where Jane Seymour gave birth and died. They walk the same paths that Anne Boleyn walked when she was queen. At that time, she thought she was untouchable. Then Henry decided she had to die. Hampton Court Palace started as Thomas Wolsey's monument to ambition. It was a commoner's attempt to build something magnificent enough to impress kings and emperors. But it became Henry VIII's palace of power and paranoia. It was a place where beauty masked violence. Here, courtiers smiled while plotting murder. Here, 6 women became queens, and 2 of them ended up with their heads on the execution block. Here, luxury and terror lived side by side in perfect, terrible harmony. The palace is beautiful. Make no mistake. It is one of the most stunning buildings in England. The architecture is breathtaking. The gardens are gorgeous. The art collection is world-class. However, beauty does not erase history. Hampton Court's history is soaked in blood. Anne Boleyn walked these halls. Jane Seymour died in these rooms. Catherine Howard was arrested here, interrogated here, and destroyed here. Their lives ended because they could not give Henry what he wanted. Their lives ended because they threatened his pride. Or perhaps they simply existed at the wrong moment in his increasingly unstable, increasingly paranoid reign. They were young. They were intelligent. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Henry killed them or let them be killed. It was the same thing. The ghosts of Hampton Court Palace are not just Victorian legends invented to sell postcards. They are reminders. They remind us that this beautiful building has dark secrets. They remind us that kings were once above the law. They remind us that women could be executed for failing to produce male heirs. They could also be executed for daring to have sexual desires or for simply being inconvenient. They remind us that power corrupts absolutely. They remind us that paranoia kills. They remind us that no amount of wealth, luxury, or magnificence can hide the stench of injustice. 500 years later, people still report seeing Catherine Howard's ghost in the haunted gallery. They still feel that inexplicable cold. They still hear sounds they cannot explain. Perhaps it is suggestion. Perhaps it is drafts and old buildings settling. Perhaps it is overactive imaginations fueled by too many ghost stories. Or perhaps, just perhaps, Catherine is still there. She is still running. She is still screaming. She is still trying to reach Henry. She is still begging for the mercy she never received. She is still trapped in the worst moment of her short, tragic life. She is forever 19 years old. She is forever terrified. She is forever alone in that gallery. She is seconds away from being dragged back to the rooms where her life would end. This would be an interrogation, imprisonment, and a scaffold at the Tower of London. Hampton Court Palace is open to visitors year-round. You can walk through the Tudor courtyards. You can see Henry's Great Hall. You can visit the Chapel Royal, where Jane Seymour's son was christened. You can stand in apartment 33, where she died. You can walk down the haunted gallery and see if you feel it. Perhaps you will feel that chill. You might sense that presence. You could feel that you are not alone. And if you do feel it, if the hair on your arm stands up for no reason, if you hear something you cannot quite identify, if you turn around, you might think you see a figure in a long gown running toward you. For just a split second, its mouth might be open in a silent scream. Do not be alarmed. It is just Catherine. She is still trapped. She is still running. She is still haunting the palace that destroyed her. This has been the cursed history of Hampton Court Palace. It was the paradise that became a prison. It was the palace where Henry VIII murdered his wives. It was a place where beauty and violence coexisted in perfect, terrible harmony. It was also where ghosts walked the galleries 5 centuries after their deaths. Next time, we will explore another one of Henry's palaces. That is the Tower of London. There, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and dozens of other prisoners spent their final days before walking to the scaffold. There, the walls literally ran with blood. There, torture chambers operated in the basements while state banquets happened upstairs. There, England's darkest secrets are buried in unmarked graves beneath the chapel floor. Until then, remember this. Every beautiful building has a history. Sometimes that history is darker than you ever imagined. Please subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I will see you in the next one.